nothing is more important than finding a role in the community, finding a way to get involved. And I hope after today that even after the discussions, always feel inspired, feel motivated. We just need more people to get involved and help the movement, because when it's all said and done, especially here at AIC, a wise man told me, it is a movement. What we're doing here at the school is a movement. All right, without further ado, our first panel will be starting. On a side note, between each panel of discussion, there will be a 15-minute intermission. And I want to make it very clear, this is a real 15-minute break, so kindly make sure to be prompt and be ready for our next panel of discussion again. It's 15 minutes, and let's move on here. The first panel, which is going to be about the American foreign policy and the Muslim world. The moderator is Azeem Ibrahim. Azeem Ibrahim is a fellow at ISPU and a research scholar at Harvard University. He is also a member of the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy's Dean's International Council. Mr. Ibrahim has been named an emerging world leader by Yale in their World Fellows Program and a top 100 global thinker by the LSDP European Social Think Tank. It is my pleasure to welcome the moderator, Azeem Ibrahim, who will be introducing the rest of today's panel.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. First of all, before I start, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Ali, your server, and also everybody involved in this very great project at AIC. This is truly a remarkable place. It is the first project of its kind in the United States. It is the first full-time permanent college that is teaching Islamic studies here in the US. For the first time, we will see that the Quran is being taught alongside American history, anthropology, philosophy, literature, political science, and so on. It's been a decade since 9/11, and the forces of intolerance in both the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world have done their best to prevent the integration between Muslims and non-Muslims and good neighborliness. And the establishment of this school is a real victory of tolerance over intolerance. Now, it is only in the month of September, but so far 2011 has been a remarkable year. If somebody at the beginning of this year told me that in this year we will witness the end of President Ben Ali's 24-year-long rule in Tunisia, and the end of Hosni Mubarak's 30-year rule in Egypt, and the end of Gaddafi's 42-year rule in Libya, I would have asked them what they were smoking. I would have assumed that this is only going to happen with some very big external force, a cataclysmic event that will rock the structures of the status quo. After all, this is a region in which stability meant entrenching the power of those structures. And those regimes have had decades to practice how to stay in power and how to consolidate their power base. So what could have possibly moved them? And if you told me that they would be removed by Tunisians, Egyptians, and Libyans, I would have found that very hard to believe. And as analysts of foreign policy, we have to raise our hands and admit that we did not see this coming. After all, anybody that studies foreign policy will know that when you study the Middle East, people power simply does not enter into the equation. The Middle East is the last remaining place that has been resisting democracy, a trend that has been sweeping the world since the fall of the Berlin Wall. But this year, all of that has changed. So the question we now put to our panel today is that how does this affect US foreign policy in the Muslim world? And how does it help or harm the image of the United States in that part of the world? Now, before I pass it to my panel, I'd like to give you my own interpretation of events. On aggregate, I believe that the Arab Spring has helped the United States' image in the Muslim world. But it is not as clear-cut as that, because there are good arguments on each side. First of all, let's examine the argument that the Arab Spring has actually harmed the image of the US. Now, this case rests simply on the premise and the simple argument that the Arab Spring has now refocused our attention in terms of what the role the United States has played in propping up dictators in that part of the world. Now, this is something that we cannot brush aside and brush under the carpet. The United States has given billions of dollars to the Mubarak regime. It said that Tunisia's Ben Ali was a model Arab ruler when it came to cooperation with the United States, and it reopened its embassy in Libya after it was closed in protest in 1972 by the US ambassador. And this is before we mention one of our most staunchest allies in that region, Saudi Arabia, which sent in troops into Bahrain to quell the uprising there. So the argument here is that the Arab Spring has shown the light and has refocused our attention on what US policy has done to support autocratic regimes at the expense of the people. And by the way, that is no longer controversial to say. Consider this quote, for example. For 60 years, my country, the United States, has pursued a policy of stability at the expense of democracy in this region. This isn't a quote by some left-wing firebrand. This is actually from the former US Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, from the Bush administration, speaking at the American University in Cairo. But all said and done, I believe the Arab Spring has been a net positive for the US image. The US has acted in a way that it shows it better understands the Middle East than previous administrations. Now, as an academic, I'm a firm believer in evidence-based policy. And last year, I put together a report on terms of how the United States can improve its image in the Muslim world. And I argued in that report that it's simply not good enough to project our own ideas on what the Muslim world wants. After all, this was what part of the Bush doctrine was, that if you remove dictators, the people will automatically revert to democracy and free markets. But instead, we should base it upon scientific evidence of what the Muslim world wants. And today, we have a lot of evidence. We have very good evidence in terms of what Muslims actually think. Between 2001 and 2007, the Gallup poll organization undertook the most deepest and most comprehensive survey of the Muslim world, in which they interviewed over 50,000 people in 35 countries. And the evidence from this extensive scientific survey shows that the two things that the Muslim world admires the most is, first of all, American technology. They love the Apples and the Googles and the fact the US put a man on the moon in 1969. And the second thing is that they love American freedoms and American values. At the same time, the evidence shows that the two things that they dislike the most is a lack of respect that is shown to Islam. And secondly, and this is actually the most astonishing thing, the second biggest fear that they had was actually of a US invasion of their country. People in these cosmopolitan societies like Turkey and Egypt and Malaysia actually believed that the United States had designs on their country and the US would actually invade their country. And this is why the US withdrawal from Iraq is so important, because residents in Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Palestinian territories, Tunisia, Turkey and Algeria said that the number one thing that the United States can do to improve its image is to withdraw from Iraq. And this is consistent with the deeper attitude of fear of the US. Now, the Obama administration has reacted to the Arab Spring sensitively and catering for this fear. And by welcoming this change and supporting the people, the administration has balanced the desire of the people of Libya, Tunisia, and Egypt with the desire not to impose that change from the outside. Let's not forget that many foreign policy analysts believe that the end of the Mubarak regime would be a primary threat to the United States and a primary threat to its most important ally in the region, Israel. After all, the United States has troops stationed in Alexandria. It has troops stationed at the Cairo West Air Base. It has overflight rights over Egypt, and it has guaranteed transit rights for US warships through the Suez Canal. So if you are a US president looking at all of this and looking at the protesters in Tahrir Square and their demand to end the regime of the individual who has granted you all those rights, you appreciate that the decision is not without risk in supporting the people. But by putting the United States on the side of ordinary Egyptians and their aspirations, the US has shown it understands the legitimate concerns of these people. And I would not go as far as saying that there's a pattern here. After all, there's policy in Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, but has not transpired. Will we see the same sort of policy in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia? We don't know. But certainly we have started to mend that relationship. Let me just finish off by predicting a few things. I believe that the United States will now pay much more attention to the Arab street. Until this year, United States policy was conducted in the Middle East primarily through the prism of oil and military interests. And this was because they only engaged with the leaders of those countries and not with the populations. Now, new factors have now entered into the equation from the Arab Spring, which have now inserted themselves into the geopolitical realities of that part of the world, and that is the sentiment of the people. Many of the demands will align with our demands here in the US, the requirement for elections, political rights, freedom of speech and aspirations. On the other hand, some of the demands may not align with our interest. For example, the new Egyptian regime is likely to get much tougher with US military presence in their country. And that means that relations will be less predictable than they have been in the past. And we have already seen this. Already, the president was ordered to rescue the Israelis from the Israeli embassy in Cairo, something that would not have happened during the previous administration. But when the dust settles, I believe that this is a huge and positive development for the United States. So before further ado, our speakers are going to analyze some of these events in much more detail and with much more scope. First of all, to the far side, we have Dr. Muqtada Khan, who's a professor of international relations at the University of Delaware. He obtained his PhD from Georgetown University in political science and Islamic studies. He is also a fellow at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. He will be discussing how democracy has presented a challenge to US foreign policy in the Muslim world. After that, we have Jeffrey Laurenti. He's a senior fellow and director of the Foreign Policy Program at the Century Foundation. He's a former executive director at the United Nations Association of the US. He's a Harvard graduate and multilingual. He'll be discussing the historical overview of US diplomatic engagement in the Muslim world. And finally, we are very fortunate to have the eminent John Edwin Morose, who's the president and chief executive of the East-West Foundation. John has over the years advised over 20 governments and received numerous awards. He'll be discussing what needs to change in the US interaction with the Muslim world. So without much further ado, I'd like to invite our first speaker.